First, I'd suggest everybody stand up for a minute to stretch. And I guarantee my talk will be lively. I might be accused of trying to make you all foragers and herbalists, but it'll be science-based, okay? All right, thank you, and it's great to follow my colleagues here. It's great to be here at the Natural Areas Conference again. It's wonderful to see so many people here, and it's great to have this in Kansas. I've been blessed to have a career where I've done lots of science and restoration, and also have delved into ethnobotany, and you're going to hear a mix of those. My take-home message is, especially with restoration sites, we need to involve people in them more to make them more appreciated, to get more management, to get more enjoyment, and hopefully to promote more health of people too. So I'm going to talk about ethnobotany engagement of people. And of course, we've heard quite a bit about fire, and I'm a big promoter of fire. Fire does provide us with conundrums. The history of prairies is not all that long here, especially in the tallgrass prairie. And so the history of this area of prairie is also the length of time that humans have been here. And we talk about what original fire frequency is. We have to talk about humans' use of fire, because fires were at least in part human managed here. And one of the great things thinking about prairies and prairie restoration, savannas and others, is that we need human involvement. And I want to encourage all of us to think about restoration as an activity in which we can all involve other people and have them do positive things for the environment, right? So it's a great opportunity, especially in this time where we're kind of culturally depressed over a lot of things, but one of those being climate change and changes in our lands and landscape. I want to talk to us about plants. You can see a lot of plant pictures. I like to say things that people don't think about a lot, but you know, milkweed is one of my favorite foods. Most people know milkweed as a poisonous plant, or more recently as a pollinator plant. Those are both true, and it's also edible. So one of the reasons we should plant it in restorations, of course, is so that we can eat it. That gets people out into restoration sites. Most of the tribes of the region still, Potawatomi, Omaha, Winnebago, all of them in our region are still eating milkweed soup every spring. We should do that too. I'm just coming out with a new edition of my Edible Wild Plants, the Prairie book, and I'm much more focused on people's involvement with food, and of course medicine too in my other work. Bee balm, important plant of the region. Most of us use it in restoration. Seeds easy to come by. Still used tremendously on reservations, both as medicine, as a strong tea, and one I really like is for the Omaha. It's an attractant. Males use it as a perfume. Washdima is the name for this plant in Lakota. I'm pleased to announce that we're embarking upon adding ethnobotany to the USDA plants database. If you make use of it regularly, we're going to create a new tab for it in ethnobotany. We're going to work with tribal language programs starting this year to get tribal names for these plants on the website, interpretations of them, hopefully a sound clip, and a little bit of short use to broaden the extent of this database and to also honor the people who are here before. I've had great privilege of working with many Native people across the region and learning about their uses, because for me, to learn about prairie and learn about uses of plants, food, medicine, crafts, you need to work with the people who were here before. In doing that work, I've gone after many historical figures. Melvin Gilmore, some of you may have heard of. He did this book, Uses of Plants of the Upper Missouri River region, which he compiled work in 19-teens, 1920s. Tremendous work. He was a museum person. He did not finish his work. He died of Parkinson's disease. I think may have been inflicted by museum curation practice of the time, using pretty toxic chemicals. Museum work has provided a lot of problems for museum workers over the years. Because of that, he didn't finish his work with the Arikara in North Dakota. He did interviews in the 1920s and 30s. I learned about that work from linguists and studied his papers at the University of Nebraska, North Dakota Historical Society, University of Michigan, and at the Smithsonian. His book was very influential to me. It's a little hard to use, but I've incorporated his work into my work and have now been sharing that work with tribes. There are many plants used by people, and many plants that I want to encourage you to think about prairie plants. We've heard a lot here about the problem with woody shrubs. Now I'm going to encourage you to use woody shrubs in prairie restorations. Use them for food. We need to manage them. Management is always part of prairie restoration. Chokecherries were the most widely used fruit across the Great Plains, Midwest by native peoples. Dried, used as food, pits and all. Very important thing in pemmican mix. Gilmore studied these. He also collected goods as a traditional chokecherry pounder, which is now at the Smithsonian. And in it, you can find that chokecherries were pounded, pits and all. The little white flecks you might see in that picture are pieces of the pit or stone. A lot like eating gritty pears, those little stone cells in gritty pears, but very tasty. And the kernels, the seeds with the nut meats within the woody shell also have considerable protein. We put together this historical work from the Arikara. I worked with the Arikara colleagues, including a former professor at Arikara at the University of Kansas, Michael Yellowbird, and we've published this book on Arikara ethnobotany using historical notes. I'm really pleased this book is free as a PDF online, which you can find on my website or just by searching for it. I was even more pleased that we got grant funding to distribute the book as hardcover on the reservation for both youth and elders. Piece of that book is we all have food sheds, food territories we think about today. It was wonderful to recreate this Arikara food shed. This is the territorial area that we have documentation of Arikara collecting plant materials. If you look at the triangles, those are village sites. The north end is a rectangle. That's the Fort Berthold Reservation where the Arikara live today. Good anthropological evidence that people typically collect plants, within 20 or 30 miles of their village site, if you're mostly on foot or even horseback. So that's the deep purple circles. We know people collect further for plants that are really important to them, medicinal plants. And the far extensions of this map relate on documentation to the pre-settlement ranges of plants. The Arikara went to the eastern forest, collected plants that are only in central Minnesota. They collected plants from the Rocky Mountains that we know they traveled to in their histories. And they also went downstream the Missouri River. Good documentation of them trading for Osage orange wood for their bows with the Osage tribe, which brought them down to the Kansas City area. So this is a food shed based mostly on prairie plants. But it's been involved in restoration projects. Here's one we did near Kansas City. Typical mix of getting a bunch of volunteers to collect local wildflower forb seed, purchasing native grass seed, drilling in the grass seed. We used a cyclone seeder and hand distributed our wildflower seeds. We gave no thought to plants that might have food or medicine uses in this restoration. And part of my job today is encourage you to think about culturally significant plants in your seed list for restorations. Here's another project we did near Lawrence. The fun thing of restoration, of course, is seeding involving people. These paper sacks people are carrying are their own little mix of wildflower seeds that we spread on this low wetland prairie area or field that became a wetland prairie near Lawrence. The most widely used food of Native Americans, wild collected food, was the prairie turnip, or Timsonla in Lakota. How many of you know this plant? I'm curious, for those of you who've been involved in restoration projects, how many of you know the plant list of what you've planted generally? For those who raised your hands, how many of you included prairie turnips in your planting seed list? I see a couple hands. Majority did not, and this was the most important wild food across the region. Seeds are not very readily available. It's hard to purchase seeds. It's not one that's been easily grown by seed companies, so it's not readily available. The plants are believed to point to each other. This is a wind-dispersed tumbleweed plant, distributed seeds by blowing across the landscape. I think they may point to each other. If you get a strong enough wind to break off the top of a Pediamelum or Sorolidium, they're going to blow in a straight line. They might scatter seeds in a straight line. They might point to each other. Prairie turnips are still a food and reservation. I've had opportunity to do quite a bit of work on the Rosebud Reservation. You still have people digging prairie turnips there, using them for food, traditional food. They're a potato substitute, but they're high in protein. They're slow-growing plants. They haven't entered our food system much, although Sean Sherman, the sous chef, is trying to work them into his restaurants. So we may see them on some menus somewhere. Important enough that they ended up in the Smithsonian and the Rickera collections. Plums, another plant that most of us may not consider a prairie plant, right? Of course they're a prairie plant. They invade our prairies, we think. Well, they're part of the prairie. Many of these woody shrubs are part of the prairie. We need to manage them. We need to eat them. You know, you don't want your patches to get too big. They're hard to pick. You want them small and tidy. Good to burn them. Good to have multiple patches. Burn them, remove some, get others. I love plums. Plum jelly, how many of you like plum jelly? Yeah. Flavorful, flavorful. And there's more species of plum jelly. This is in sandhill prairies west of here, out in central Kansas. We get these sand prairies. Wonderful sandhill plums, Prunus angustifolia. Tasty. We need those in our restoration sites because you will get people to go pick them. If you get people to pick them, they're going to have identity with that area where they pick. They are more likely to get involved in management of that prairie. If we want to diversify our attendance to these conferences, we need to have more plants that Native people use in them. They want to return to them themselves to use these plants. I think adding food and medicine plants to restoration will encourage more people to be involved and cultural diversity. This plant, Apios americana, hopness, groundnuts. How many of you know this plant? How many of you planted it in a restoration site? Thank you. You know this plant's mostly sterile, doesn't produce seeds. This, I now have come to believe, was the most widely used food plant of the prairie region before corn, beans, and squash were introduced. Abundant in wet prairies. Topeka, Kansas is the doe or toe of the Kansas Kaw language. And Topeka literally translates as a good place to grow this plant, a good plant to grow wild potatoes. People don't even know that. Our floodplain areas, these rich soils, agricultural soils, had this plant. It's hard to find today. Curious dislocation. There's some of this plant, not in the western plains, but around Boulder. I think it was taken there and planted. We don't give enough attention to this thought that some of the distribution, the far range distributions of plant materials could have been planted. This one is possibly that. This one you need to propagate by tubers. It's easy to do. You grow them, you dig them, you put them in wet soiled areas, and they'll take off. Wonderful viney plant, really productive, make lots of food. The tubers taste great. Boil them. Even little nibble plants, wild parsley. Wild parsley is a great plant. Yes, there's other parsley relatives are poisonous. Very few people get poisoned by plants. It's quite a misnomer. We have much bigger worries. Yes, learn your plants, teach people to learn your plants. We all need to learn our plants, right? We can use our apps too. This is a tasty plant. Little nibble plant. Mints. Mints are used in teas. They're flavorful. Lots of cultural knowledge of when you harvest this plant. Slender mountain mint is really good in the spring, gets more bitter, bad taste later. I mentioned bee balm. Bee balm had 4 names. The taxonomy of the Pawnee had 4 names for what we call Monarda fistulosa, all based on different tastes. If you start tasting, smelling Monarda fistulosa at different times of the year, you'll notice they're different. If you look at them in different places, they vary place to place. There are at least chemotaxonomic groups within it. And it's still used widely on reservations. It's up on the Potawatomi Reservation where it's collected for cultural use. Gilmore collected it and wrote down some notes in Lakota about its uses in medicine. Jerusalem artichokes, kind of a bane of gardeners, right? How many of you have grown this in your garden and have it escape and like cover up part of your garden, right? How many of you plant it in your prairie restorations? It's an edge prairie species, abundant in roadsides, just finished blooming in eastern Kansas, all over the place. Makes nice tubers. You've seen sunchokes probably in the grocery store occasionally. They're tasty. They're considered a good food for diabetics because they have more inulin than other carbohydrate sources. It breaks down more slowly. That name, though, may relate to the Omaha's translated name of this plant, which is the food for homeless boys. Slow breaking down foods are something that's indigestible, or at least partially. This plant causes gas. Some people call it fartichokes. That food for homeless boys may have been after boys eating too many. Lots of cultural stories, right? Anyway, this plant should be planted a lot more. It's great for pollinators, too. Wild tomatillos, ground cherries, they're really tasty. They were important food of native people. They're weedy. They spread. They're definitely a prairie plant. You find them in most every prairies. We have multiple species. This is Physalis longifolia. We did chemistry work on this and discovered interesting anti-cancer compounds that the University of Kansas worked on. Of all the foliage of prairie plants that we studied for antioxidants, my crew, we collected over 200 species of prairie plants and tested them for anti-cancer compounds, antioxidants. This species, the foliage had higher levels of antioxidants than any other plant we tested. Vitamin C. The fruits are tasty when they're ripe. It took me years to realize I was eating green fruits. You know, it'd be like if I invited you over to my house and then I said, oh, I've got some tomatoes, and I go out and chop up some nice green tomatoes and serve them to you. You're going to think tomatoes aren't too tasty, right? Worse, what if I cooked up tomato greens? You know, they're poisonous. We eat poisonous plants all the time, you know. But anyway, this plant, the ground cherry or the wild tomatillo, full of antioxidants. When we were finding these anti-cancer compounds, we wanted to test the fruits. The fruits have anti-cancer compounds, which is good for our health. Native Americans ate lots of these, which may be one reason reported rates of cancer were lower by Native people. They ate better diets. They also didn't live as long, but they ate better diets. I didn't realize, but antioxidants, preservatives, antioxidants, what used to, preserve cereals, those sort of things. Vitamin C, you can put it on apples so that they don't brown. We couldn't get these fruits to dry. I picked a bunch of tomatillo fruits. We had them sitting in the lab. A month went by, and they were still green, turning yellow fruits. I finally cut them up and dried them like you can see in this picture, but those antioxidants were preserving them. They weren't drying, they weren't molding, they just sat there. Kind of interesting. We ended up growing lots of this plant, and it's really, kind of telling, but all of our push, all of us are trying to get people to plant more native plants. When you mass plant many of our native plants, you get insect problems. Even though this plant has poisonous foliage, we had a lot of insect problems. And that's why plants like physalis, like milkweeds in nature are often pretty dispersed. That's a pretty good strategy for insects not finding you. This shows the prevalence of wild tomatillos. The green are the states or provinces which it's found. There's a list of tribes. We have documentation who've used it in the past. The red circles are just some of the sites. There's many more archaeological sites where wild tomatillo seeds are found in the hearth or cooking areas. You know, in the Great Plains, archaeological sites don't have a lot of plant materials because food rots or spoils, you know, in the soil. We don't have a lot of caves. But if things are burnt or charred, they preserve well. And unfortunately, humans have a long history of burning food when they cook. How many of you burnt food ever when you cook, right? So if you have seeds, you know, they'll char and be preserved. Commonly, these seeds are found, along with Echinopodium seeds, amaranth seeds, around cooking areas. And wild tomatillos are also a medicine. I've not been able to untangle this specimen at the Smithsonian that Gilmore collected. It's a species which is only from the southeast today, Lanceolata. I think it was probably Physalis longifolio, but kind of a botanical conundrum. I've gone and looked at the botany identification books of the 1920s and 30s and haven't figured it out. I've spent time on the Omaha Reservation driving county roads collecting 3 species of Physalis, but not Lanceolata. I think it's longifolio. But interesting botanical things to figure out for many of these plants. I'm going to talk about Echinacea. I have opportunity to help write the book on Echinacea. As I mentioned, I'm going to encourage you to be herbalists too, and encourage people that work with you to use plants for medicine. Echinacea was the most widely used medicinal plant across the Great Plains, used as a cure-all, used for snake bite, used for any type of blood, injuries, wounds, all sorts of things. It's a cure-all of all sorts. And then it's not surprising today that we find there's immune-stimulating compounds in the plant, both in the carbohydrate fraction of the plant, and if you remove that, there's yet at least one other compound in the plant that stimulates the immune system. Immune stimulation helps us get over colds and sickness and flu, makes us stronger. Another thing I'll just touch base on, signage. We need more signage, especially in our small restorations, especially in our prairie plantings that we can label or identify because people visit. This is a project I was involved in recently in Omaha, Nebraska with the National Park Service. Lewis and Clark Center there has a nice native garden right along really the Missouri River just north of downtown Omaha. Omaha tribe is why Omaha, Nebraska has its name. There's very little recognition of the Omaha people in Omaha. So we took on a project working with the Omaha Nation to replace and provide signage there that includes Omaha names and uses for plants. So this sign is being replaced in the next couple of years to also talk about the Omaha name and uses of purple coneflower, which among other uses, it was used called the comb plant. Several tribes, the translation of Echinacea is the comb plant, and you can use the cones to actually comb your hair. And I think it wasn't so much that it was the only source of a comb, but it was like, oh, you could comb your hair with this plant, right? We have several species right here. We're on the western edge of Echinacea pallida, but here in west is Echinacea angustifolia. Many of you are gardeners, grow Echinacea purpurea. Those 3 species all have been used in herbal medicine and in medicine around the world, even though they're all native species to the U.S. and a little bit of Canada. There's a picture from Germany where they're cultivating Echinacea purpurea to make tinctures that are in the pharmacies behind the counter. Here in the U.S., if you use herbal products, they might be at a pharmacy. They'd be in front of the counter with, herbal products and Pampers and Coca-Cola. but the real stuff's behind the counter. Europe is much further along than we are in integrating traditional medicine, herbal medicine with pharmaceutical products. We're kind of owned by the pharmaceutical companies here, if you look at it in terms of medicine. A really good example is, I think, if people had been taking Echinacea or other immune-stimulating plant material during COVID, fewer people would have died. Not because Echinacea is a cure. Many, many people died because of other illnesses, weaknesses at the same time. A boosted immune system would have helped. Our federal government gave the pharma companies $10 billion needed. I believe in vaccines. I've taken vaccines. Believe in that. I've also avoided getting COVID. I'm careful. I also consume Echinacea and other immune-stimulating substances. If our government would have spent just $1 billion or so on herbal products, made them readily available, I think we would have had more people survive the COVID incident. Here's a picture of material being prepared. This is a German product, cream for wounds. There's great scientific evidence of herbal products. Echinacea has been widely studied. Here's a good randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial of Echinacea. If you're flying long distance, this study was about flying from Australia to the US or flying from Australia to Europe. If you consume Echinacea before, during, and after your flight, you're less likely to get the cold or flu, or if you do get it, your symptoms are reduced or last not as long. We all know when you're on a plane and the guy next to you is hacking away that you're at risk. This would help. Or there's another study that shows that Echinacea, in this case also elderberry, is as effective as Tamiflu. Eastern European study. Again, clinical trial, data, really good data. And then there's studies showing Echinacea is really relatively safe, although a few people do get allergies to plants in that family. It's pretty minor, but we always have people with allergies, so when you're encouraging people to use plants, realize everybody needs to be careful. People react to things, so go slow, try a little bit. You might be a reaction. Many of our herbal products, though, have not been studied well. There's many things out there that should be concerned about, but I want to encourage people to realize there is some good data on quite a few wild plants. So I encourage that. At the same time, we also have to think about using wild plants. Long history of harvest in Kansas and elsewhere. This is a 1960s poster, actually in Oklahoma, for purple coneflower roots. Boomed again in the 1990s, so there became concern about wild harvest, especially with the Echinacea angustifolia. Still today, Echinacea angustifolia has almost entirely supplied the herbal product market through wild harvest. Kansas is the leading export state for that, although there's considerable harvests up in the northern Great Plains. This is the most accurate map of Echinacea angustifolia based on herbarium specimens that myself or Craig Freeman have actually looked at. I apologize, folks in Minnesota. There's a few more counties I need to add. We now have a county in Missouri, too, that needs to be added to this map. But this is pretty accurate of where this species occurs, and it really likes rocky areas. We got contract money from the Forest Service for national grasslands, national forests. The green areas are national forest lands because there was concern about Echinacea being over-harvested, Echinacea angustifolia, in the 1990s. There's not really police on national grasslands or national forests to any extent, so people can come in and harvest. And there was, we estimated across the Great Plains, several million Echinacea plants were harvested in that decade. I believe strongly in learning from traditional people. In Kansas, we have traditional Echinacea harvesters. Out in western Kansas, north of Hayes, and elsewhere, we've documented 120 years of Echinacea harvest in Kansas, which continues to today. Saw an internet ad for someone buying roots and furs out of Hoisington, Kansas, online. So we did an experiment both out in near Hays, Kansas, and up near Miles City, Montana, and dug plants in both places. Oops, jumped. And went back. We harvested, marked, and went back to these sites 2 years later, dug them again, and you can see just above the fingers of where this plant resprouted. So we had learned from the harvesters that they couldn't get rid of it. The plants came back. I thought it was mostly from seed. The plant makes lots of seed. At both our Kansas sites and Montana sites, revisiting 2 years later, digging up all that we could find that we had marked, 50% of plants resprouted. Plus there were seedlings. A lot of regrowth. Wrapping this up, plant materials. This is at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence. It's been great to work with them. We've provided medicinal plants for their cultural center. There's a new medicinal plant garden. Yet another one. It'll be the third at KU going in this year that the native student group is planting. I haven't mentioned pollinators, but I'll make a pitch. Many of these plants also have pollinator attributes. Food, medicine, pollinators. Okay, so we really need to consider these plants in our restorations. We need to think more about edge species. Those woody species are edge species, species that like a little bit of shade, that are part of prairies. I can't speak enough about weeds. We need to encourage weeds. Might we want to consider planting them? One of my favorite foods is lamb's quarters in the spring. Lamb's quarters are a native species. So are amaranth greens. Or at least they can be part of the early succession of our prairie restorations, right? So woody species, weedy species, we need to make sure we think about them. We have a medicinal plant garden at Lawrence. We'll take some people on a tour there tomorrow. All of you are welcome to come visit. It's open. You can find it online. We label plants, learn about them there. So we need to envision plants and people to restore landscapes. We harvest and manage landscapes for our community, with our community, for our communities, and for others. Thank you. I'll be glad to answer questions later.